A beautiful young woman who just this morning was wearing a wedding dress lay in a cold coffin by the afternoon. Last night she was drained of her blood by the vampire king. Dracula, the vampire hunter, Van Helsing, heard the news and rushed to the scene. Tonight, he must stop the girl from becoming Dracula's bride. Late at night, Van Helsing and his men broke into the girl's tomb. They pried open the stone coffin, but it was empty. Suddenly, a strange sound came from the entrance. The dead woman, now dressed in her wedding gown and holding a baby, was approaching them step by step. Her mouth was stained with blood, and she looked utterly grotesque. Van Helsing held out his crucifix and forced the vampire back into the coffin. In 1462, the Turks swept across Europe, threatening all of Christianity. A great general from Romania, Count Dracula, was given the critical mission. After bidding farewell to his beloved wife, Elizabeth, he left for the battlefield. There, Dracula fought with fierce bravery, pushing the Turks back in defeat and finally achieving a hard-won victory. However, before the enemy was completely routed, they spread a rumor that Dracula had been tragically defeated and killed in battle. The rumors spread like wildfire, and his wife, Elizabeth, who loved him deeply, believed them. Overcome with grief, she threw herself into the river and took her own life. When Dracula returned victorious, he was greeted by the sight of his wife's cold body. The bishop coldly declared that all who commit suicide will fall into hell. In that moment, Dracula's faith was shattered. He had fought and bled to defend the church, and in return, he was met with the eternal separation from his wife. He raised his sword and plunged it into a crucifix. As he renounced God, the crucifix began to bleed. Dracula cupped the blood in his hands and uttered a curse. 400 years passed. One day, a lawyer named Jonathan received a major assignment. A Romanian man named Dracula wanted to purchase 10 properties in bustling London.
Close these transactions. Your future with this firm is assured.
We can be married when I return.
Jonathan bid farewell to his fiancée, Mina, and traveled to Romania to sign the contract. Little did he know that his fiancée looked exactly like Dracula's wife from 4 centuries ago. And even less did he know that 3 beautiful female vampires were waiting for him. After several days, Jonathan's train arrived in Romania late at night. A carriage dropped him off. Amidst the lightning and thunder, an inverted crucifix and the surrounding wild wolves filled him with a deep sense of unease. In the mist, a carriage silently appeared. Jonathan got in and was soon brought to an ancient castle. The presence of something sinister was palpable. The old man in the red robe with a pallid complexion was none other than Count Dracula, the master of the castle. Dracula had long, slender fingers, and while his manner of speaking was elegant, he exuded a strange and sinister charm.
Defend the church against all enemies of Christ.
Yes.
Blood is too precious a thing in this time.
Jonathan was deeply uneasy. He had assumed he could simply sign the contract and leave as quickly as possible. He never could have imagined that when Dracula saw a photograph of Jonathan's fiancée, Mina, he would be unable to conceal his profound excitement. He had waited 400 years. Could this woman be the reincarnation of his wife?
Are you married, Count?
Ages ago, it seems. She died. My life at its best is...
A month. Do you wish me to stay so long?
Late that night, Jonathan was shaving in front of the mirror, preparing to leave at the first light of dawn. Suddenly, a withered hand appeared behind him. A razor nicked Jonathan's neck. Suppressing his thirst for blood, he helped Jonathan shave, telling him in a tone that allowed for no refusal. For the next month, Jonathan must remain here and teach him English customs. The crucifix on Jonathan's chest seemed to burn Dracula. In that moment, Jonathan finally realized he was in grave danger. In the dead of night, Jonathan restlessly explored the castle. A cobweb-covered curtain slowly drew open. He saw white gauze shifting on the floor, and 3 captivating, sensuous women emerged from beneath it. The women were alluring and seductive, and Jonathan found himself completely enthralled. These 3 female vampires were Dracula's brides. Dracula appeared, instructing them to keep an eye on Jonathan, while he had his servants pack soil from the castle grounds into wooden crates. His next destination was London, where he would seek his love and unleash a reign of terror.
I love him and I've said yes!
Thunder rumbled and lightning flashed, hinting at the coming storm. A few nights later, Jonathan's fiancée, Mina, suddenly awoke. She saw her best friend, dressed in a red gown, walking eerily into the courtyard. When Mina rushed to her side in a panic, she saw a monster biting her friend's neck. Mina's presence caught the monster off guard. It couldn't bear to look at her and fled in a panic. Mina helped her friend up, completely unaware that the monster was Dracula in a different form, and that her friend was about to become a vampire. The next day, several of the wooden crates filled with soil were carried into an abandoned church. Dracula broke out of his crate, the soil from his homeland nourishing his power. After drinking the blood, he was completely revitalized. After waiting 400 years, Dracula was impatient. He found Mina and orchestrated a fateful encounter.
Humblest apologies, sir.
Dracula was handsome and charming, with an indescribably elegant and unique demeanor. Mina, who had at first been deliberately distant, was slowly drawn to this mysterious man. Under Dracula's influence, Mina's memories from her past life gradually awakened. This left her deeply confused and conflicted. The Dracula before her was both a stranger and incredibly familiar. As Dracula spoke of his longing for his wife, Mina's eyes filled with tears, and she felt his pain. He pushed her down, intending to turn her into a vampire and keep her with him forever. But in the last moment, he couldn't do it. His deep love for Mina meant he didn't want her to become a bloodthirsty monster like himself. He was the vampire hunter, Van Helsing. That's right, Van Helsing was the reincarnation of the bishop from 400 years ago. This time he was not only a professor of occult studies, but also, by fate, a vampire hunter. Hearing that Mina's friend had been bitten by a monster, Van Helsing came to the estate to investigate. When he saw the 2 deep puncture wounds on her neck and the fangs beginning to emerge from her mouth, Van Helsing was certain the legendary vampire, Dracula, had come to London.
Dracula.
Back at Dracula's castle in Romania, Jonathan took advantage of the 3 female vampires' slumber. He climbed a high wall and jumped into the river. Having miraculously survived, he staggered to a monastery and immediately wrote a letter, which he sent to London. Soon after, Mina received the letter and was filled with both joy and worry. She was happy because Jonathan's letter instructed her to travel to the monastery at once to get married. She was worried because, in the month Jonathan had been gone, Dracula's appearance had stirred her heart. Although she constantly reminded herself of her deep love for Jonathan, her memories of a past life made her unable to let go of Dracula. Late that night, Dracula, who had been anxiously waiting for Mina, received a letter. After reading it, his eyes filled with tears of blood, and he was consumed with grief and fury. Mina had finally chosen Jonathan. In a holy church, Mina and Jonathan held their wedding. However, she couldn't shake the image of Dracula and was clearly distracted. Similarly, Mina's departure sent Dracula into a frenzy. He broke into the estate and went on a killing spree, draining the blood from Mina's friend. The next day, her friend was lifeless, lying in a cold coffin. Van Helsing knew that tonight she would turn into a monster. And so, the story came full circle to the beginning. Van Helsing led his men into the mausoleum, where they had a head-on confrontation with the newly turned vampire friend. Van Helsing used his crucifix to force the vampire back into the coffin, drove an iron stake through her heart, and then beheaded her. Although the vampire was destroyed, Dracula was enraged, and a great battle was now inevitable. After her friend's death, Jonathan and Mina returned to London for the funeral. Van Helsing found Jonathan and told him that his friend's death was only the beginning, and that Dracula would never let them go. He said it would be better to take the fight to him rather than wait to be killed.
This one we fight, this one we face.
Jonathan had witnessed Dracula's terrifying power. He told Mina to wait at home and, with Van Helsing and his men, found Dracula's lair. Holding torches, Van Helsing explained that, according to legend, Dracula's power came from the soil of his homeland, and if they destroyed the soil, Dracula would be rendered powerless. In the dark and eerie abandoned church, Dracula hung upside down from the ceiling in the form of a bat, watching the unwelcome intruders below. Unaware of his presence, the men swung their axes and began destroying the wooden crates. Dracula swooped down, and what seemed to be the start of a great battle was anything but. To see Mina again, he disregarded his own safety and transformed into a wisp of smoke, appearing before her. Seeing Dracula again, Mina's memories of her past life came flooding back like a tidal wave. She could no longer restrain her longing, and the two embraced tightly. A separation of 400 years had finally come to an end. Learning that Dracula was a vampire, Mina begged him to turn her. This time, Dracula didn't hesitate. He first drank her blood, then used his own blood to make Mina a part of him.
Mina!
Dracula revealed his true form and took out a crucifix. Van Helsing assumed that without the soil from his homeland, Dracula would be a pushover, but to his shock, Dracula's power was still immense. The wounded Dracula retreated into the darkness and disappeared, and so the hunt began. Van Helsing, in a cunning move, used Mina's new psychic connection to Dracula. Through hypnosis, he determined that Dracula was on a ship. Once he returned to Romania and reached the castle to recover his strength, they would be no match for him. So, with no time to lose, Jonathan and his team boarded a train. They were fully armed, determined to intercept and kill Dracula before he could make it back to his castle. 3 days later, because the train arrived in Romania before the cargo ship, Jonathan and Van Helsing decided to split their forces to ensure success. Jonathan would lead his men to the port to burn the ship, hoping to bury Dracula at the bottom of the sea. Van Helsing, meanwhile, would take Mina directly to the castle, in case Jonathan's plan failed. As night fell, a bewitching song suddenly echoed outside Dracula's castle. Van Helsing clutched his head, and Mina, affected by the song, transformed into a vampire ahead of schedule. All of this was the work of Dracula's 3 brides. Van Helsing drew a protective circle around himself with a torch, keeping them temporarily safe, but the accompanying horses were brutally drained of blood by the 3 vampires. The next day, as the 3 female vampires were sleeping, Van Helsing approached them silently with a blade. In a swift motion, he cut off their heads. At the same time, Jonathan's ambush at the port had failed. Protected by his servants, Dracula was now getting closer and closer to the castle. Jonathan and his men were in hot pursuit. After a fierce battle at the castle gates, Dracula's servants fell one by one. When rivals meet, their eyes burn with jealousy. Jonathan reached the wooden crate. Dracula's neck was cut, and then a blade was plunged into his chest. Just as Dracula was on the verge of death, Mina, holding a gun, stood in front of the others. As Jonathan watched, bewildered, she helped Dracula walk into the castle. In that moment, Dracula's face was grotesque, yet he was on the verge of death, and an indescribable sadness filled his expression. 400 years ago, he had lost his love here. 400 years later, after being tormented by the curse and waiting for his love, he finally felt a warmth he had never known in his love's arms. Dracula found peace.
It's a trap.
Long ago, humans and vampires were mortal enemies, their relationship marked by unending hostility. Armed with swords and shields, humans often faced vampires, who were stronger and more agile, as nothing more than helpless lambs awaiting slaughter. Fortunately, when God created this world, he granted sunlight to humanity. By night, people fought off the monster's invasion, and by day, they developed cannons and armor. After hundreds of years, the tide slowly began to turn. However, the vampire threat extended beyond mere physical battles. The fiercer the human resistance, the more ruthless the vampire's retaliation became. This war between the two species continued, wreaking devastation until it nearly destroyed the entire human world. On the brink of extinction, humanity retreated behind fortified walls, seeking protection from the church. Out of this desperate need, a unique type of human was born, one forged through a blend of science and theology, the demon-hunting clerics. The church trained these clerics in vampire-killing techniques, while the military provided them with cutting-edge equipment and technology. Thanks to their efforts, humanity eventually gained the upper hand, pushing vampires to the brink of extinction. Those who survived were captured and classified as protected species. As time passed, however, people began to fear the power of the demon-hunting clerics themselves. The church leadership ordered their disbandment, and these former heroes faded back into a society that no longer needed them. Over time, both the demon-hunting clerics and the vampires became mere stories and legends. With the war over, people busied themselves with reclaiming land, and William was among these pioneers. The land's radiation levels had almost dropped to zero, and soon, crops could be planted once more. William's work was progressing smoothly, but his family life was far less harmonious. The relocation to this barren land made work easier for him, but his teenage daughter constantly complained about their new life in the wilderness. After a heated argument over dinner, an unusual rumble shook the ground. Looking out the window, William saw a horde of pale creatures charging toward the house. His wife quickly hid their daughter in the underground shelter, urging her not to come out no matter what happened. William took up the wall-mounted cannon to defend his home, but as the cross fell to the ground, his and his wife's screams echoed through the house. The shelter door opened, and a man with a rounded hat cast his shadow over the daughter. In the Bishop City, where industrial smog forever blocked out the sun, this figure was a priest, the once feared, now wandering demon-hunting cleric. After the war, the church had risen to become the world's dominant power. Defying the church was equivalent to defying God. Daily life had been reduced to mechanical labor and constant prayer in confessional machines that stood everywhere. The priests displayed on these screens did not truly listen. The synthetic images repeated only a few programmed phrases, ensuring that the confessions flowed efficiently.
Go against the church is to go against God.
The guilt of leading his comrades into the lair of ancient horrors haunted the priest, a burden that he had yet to cast off. Now, forced to seek solace from a cold, unfeeling screen, he found it hard not to feel disillusioned as a forsaken outcast of the church. On his way home, the townsfolk dared not speak to him or any other former demon-hunting clerics. It wasn't respect, it was a deep-seated fear. Just as he stared out the window at the towering cityscape, lost in thought, a man dressed like a cowboy walked in, the sheriff of the borderlands, Hicks. It turned out that William had entrusted Hicks to find his brother, the demon-hunting priest. William's last request was for his brother to inform the church immediately in his role as a cleric. The vampires were back. The priest went to the Vatican and reported the borderlands situation to the elders, but the Pope merely found it amusing. "We eradicated the vampires long ago," he said, "and there's no record of any escapes from the protected zone." The Pope concluded that William's family had likely been attacked by bandits and ordered the local police to handle it. He reminded the priest that demon-hunting clerics were church property and strictly forbidden from leaving the city without permission. The Pope even warned him against avenging William on his own. At a bar in the city, a high-ranking church official with a friendly rapport approached the priest. "It's not about whether vampires exist or not," he cautioned, "but rather that the church is questioning your loyalty." He urged the priest not to clash with the Vatican. Each word filled the priest with sorrow. During the war, the clerics had turned the tide in favor of the church. Now, in peacetime, they were discarded, denied freedom, and separated from their loved ones. Once saviors in the name of God, they were now seen by the church as nothing more than disposable tools. Suddenly, guards burst through the doors, ready to arrest the priest. Shocked at this betrayal by an old friend, he clenched his rosary until it snapped.
Is this the world I fought for?
Returning to his quarters, he retrieved his old silver dagger and opened the warehouse's back door. Before him sat a motorcycle, modified with an airplane engine. The priest rode from day into night and from night into day, tearing across the endless desert until he finally arrived at the borderlands where William had lived. While searching through supplies for clues, Sheriff Hicks, who had first brought him William's message, appeared. Together they headed toward the center of the borderlands town. Compared to the main diocese, this area was primitive. No skyscrapers, no communication technology, more like a frontier town from the Old West. News of William's family being attacked by vampires had already spread, drawing swindlers looking to exploit the terrified townsfolk. In a lawless place like this, the sheriff dealt with these con artists directly, using methods that were as swift as they were effective. At the town's clinic, the priest's brother, William, finally regained consciousness. As soon as he saw the priest, he told him that his daughter had been taken by vampires. Then, in a moment of weakness, William confessed a long-held guilt. William's wife had once been the priest's wife. Before he became a demon-hunting cleric, the priest had entrusted his wife to William's care, hoping that the war would end quickly so he could return and resume his life with her. But the war dragged on, and eventually William and she grew close and married. William, now at death's door, begged the priest to rescue his daughter. With that, he passed away. The next day, the priest buried William and his wife, setting off on a journey of vengeance and rescue for his niece. Back at his brother's home, he and Sheriff Hicks tracked the vampire's trail and quickly deduced that their destination was the Vampire Reserve. Vampires have two main ways of dealing with humans. They can either kill them directly or share their blood with them, the latter usually with the human's consent. Those who receive vampire blood don't become full vampires. Instead, they turn into creatures known as ghouls, half-human, half-demon monstrosities. During the war, vampires avoided sunlight and hid in ancient nests during the day. Many refugees from border areas who received no protection from the church joined the vampire ranks, becoming ghouls. Unlike vampires, ghouls were not afraid of sunlight. So while the vampires rested in their nests, these ghouls gathered intelligence on humans, ensuring that vampire attacks were calculated and precise. After the war, the surviving vampires were confined to Reserve 98, where they were now treated as a protected species and called night shadows. They could no longer drink human blood and had to rely on animal blood for sustenance. The dirty job of feeding them fell to the ghouls, who maintained the reserve. As a result, security at Reserve 98 was sparse. Knowing they'd get no straight answers from these mutated creatures, the priest and sheriff stopped wasting time and pushed open the metal hatch leading underground. The environment was dismal, and a few remaining guards lay dead in the corridors. Some cell doors had been forcibly opened. They found one ghoul, and the priest began interrogating him about his niece's whereabouts. But as they spoke, more ghouls armed with weapons appeared from deeper within the passage. The priest left one of the ghouls alive, demanding to know their plans.
They once ruled this land. They were warriors.
Then, noticing the sun sinking low on the horizon, he realized what this meant. Night was approaching, and the vampires would soon emerge. One by one, metal coffins below ground opened, and in a flash, shadowy figures began streaming out of the passage. Vampires filled the air, preparing to strike. Unhurried, the priest took out his Bible and began to recite exorcism prayers. The last vampire, sensing defeat, let out a few shrill cries before retreating. The priest returned to the subdued ghoul, who, impressed by the priest's power, revealed his niece's location. However, as soon as the ghoul mentioned the West, the priest lunged at the fleeing vampire, the struggle taking them into the deeper recesses of the underground chambers. It was becoming clear that these creatures were plotting something far more sinister. Based on the ghoul's directions, the priest and Sheriff Hicks checked the map and identified the West as the location of the ancient nest. They drove through the ruins of war, stopping on a high ridge to prepare. The journey had solidified their mutual trust, and as they discussed William's daughter, Hicks openly declared his intention to marry her, vowing to rescue her even at the risk of his own life. But the priest warned him with a grave tone. If Hicks were to be turned into a ghoul, it would be a very different fate. They continued driving until they finally spotted the old nest. Grabbing onto bones for footholds, they climbed to the entrance of one of the caves. The structure inside was like a dense, circular honeycomb, ominous and dark. Though there were no vampires in sight, the priest remained wary. He remembered leading a group of demon-hunting clerics here in the past. A single lapse in caution had resulted in one comrade being dragged away by a hidden vampire. The priest dropped a flare into the bottom of the nest, then leapt down alone, leaving Hicks outside. The maze of tunnels was complex, twisting endlessly like an eternal labyrinth. Trusting his instincts, he continued deeper. Suddenly, a dark figure flashed through one of the passages, and the priest charged, knife at the ready. But it wasn't a vampire. It was a former ally, a female cleric with whom he had once fought side by side. From the day the priest had fled the bishop's city, the church had ordered his execution. Regular guards were no match for him, so the church had dispatched 4 of his former comrades, now demon hunters, to track him down. This female cleric had separated from the group, hoping to warn him of their mission. But just as they spoke, gunshots echoed from Hicks's direction. They rushed over to find that vampires were indeed lurking within the nest. The priest gathered all his strength. He clasped his hands together, took a deep breath, The cave had been abandoned for years. Why would vampires still be guarding it? The 3 of them continued searching, uncovering a disturbing detail. One of the tunnels appeared freshly dug. Following it, they stumbled upon a newly constructed nest. As they passed through this new nest, the priest sensed a change in the air currents. A few steps further, a massive opening loomed before them. The opening pointed toward Jericho district, where the other 3 demon-hunting clerics had been dispatched. Meanwhile, in Jericho, an unregistered black train sped into the station under the watchful eye of a surprised night guard. A vampire leapt out of the train car, followed by a mysterious man in a black bowler hat. The man, as if giving orders, unleashed an entire legion of vampires into the city. The 3 demon hunters in Jericho quickly positioned themselves, launching a swift and brutal assault on the man in the black hat. At dawn, the priest and his 2 companions arrived in Jericho district, only to find that the vampires had already retreated. The night's blitz attack had left no survivors in the town. As they walked further into the city center, they witnessed a horrific scene. The 3 demon hunters who had come to protect the town were brutally killed and bound to crosses. The sight was a twisted display of cruelty. Jericho had no nearby nests or night shadow preserve areas, so how had the vampires arrived and left so quickly? The priest quickly realized the answer lay with the railway, the only feasible way to bring in vampires en masse. And that railway led straight to the bishop's city, where sunlight never penetrated. If the vampires truly planned to invade the city by train, the consequences would be disastrous. The priest realized he had been drawn into a trap. Whoever orchestrated this knew him well. They knew that kidnapping his niece would drive him to leave the bishop's city. They also understood church policy. Demon hunters belonged to the church, and any disobedience was punishable by death. By sending other demon hunters to hunt him down, the city would be left vulnerable to vampire attack. This mastermind intended to lure the priest and his fellow demon hunters far from the city with false leads, giving the vampire army ample time to overrun it. A chill ran down the priest's spine as he grasped the full scope of the plan. Fortunately, they had reached Jericho district in time. If they could catch up to the train, they might still prevent the impending massacre. The priest lowered the fallen demon hunters from their crucifixes and burned their bodies in a respectful farewell. The 3 then set off at top speed across the desert, racing through rocky terrain, until they finally spotted a thick plume of smoke from the troop train hurtling towards the bishop's city. The priest instructed the female cleric to set explosives on the tracks ahead. He sped toward the train's middle section, while Hicks jumped in from the rear. A ghoul spotted the female cleric planting explosives and immediately ordered a few others to chase her down on motorcycles. Hicks managed to pry open a train car door, revealing rows of vampires in a deep trance-like sleep. The priest climbed to the top of the train, where the man in the black hat awaited him. To the priest's shock, this man was not only someone who knew him well, he was a former ally. Years ago, when the priest led a team into the vampire nest, One of his men had been taken. This man, now in the black hat, had been turned by the vampire queen, who granted him a second life as a super ghoul, a being superior to both demon hunters and vampires. Now he was bent on aiding the vampire queen in destroying the church and reclaiming the land. Meanwhile, the female cleric finished setting the explosives on the tracks and mounted her bike to rendezvous with the priest and Hicks, but the ghouls pursuing her had nearly closed in. The priest found himself outmatched as his former comrade dodged his every move.
Join me.
A powerful punch from the black-hatted ghoul sent the priest tumbling off the train car, where he barely managed to grab onto the railing beneath. Hicks, fighting his way through the carriages, fired at an attacking vampire from above, only to find himself surrounded by a swarm of vampire spawn. After fending off the first wave, the priest and Hicks pushed forward, arriving at the final car. In the ensuing chaos, Lucy managed to break free, grabbing a kerosene lantern and hurling it at her captor. It was then that the priest saw her face clearly. Lucy was not just his niece, she was his own daughter. The man in the black hat struck Lucy, sending her sprawling across the carriage, then pinned the priest against the wall. The brutal force drove nails into his shoulders, and the searing pain caused him to lose consciousness. The black-hatted figure intended for the priest to burn alive, setting a slow, merciless fire before leaping out of the train with Lucy. Realizing that merely derailing the train at its current speed wouldn't prevent it from crashing into the bishop's city, the female cleric decided to make a final, desperate move. As the priest came to, he reached for the silver cross the cleric had entrusted to him, the only weapon left that could kill vampires. Time was running out. Less than a minute remained before the train would plow into the city. Meanwhile, the black-hatted figure was about to transform Lucy, sinking his fangs toward her neck. The black-hatted vampire moved toward them, intent on killing them both. As the smoke cleared, the battered cleric emerged from the wreckage, miraculously alive. They had averted the disaster by a hair's breadth, sparing the city, which remained blissfully unaware of the calamity it had narrowly escaped. The priest, carrying a sack, strode into the prayer hall, interrupting the cardinal's solemn prayers. In front of the startled assembly, he pulled a freshly severed vampire's head from the bag and threw it at the Pope's feet.
And their queen was not among them.
Lies! There is no vampire menace.
Confronted with a corrupt church and an apathetic, oblivious populace, the priest and his two remaining demon hunters knew they had one mission left: to spread the word of the impending danger to all remaining human strongholds, urging them to prepare for the looming battle.